Welcome back to the show, everybody. And today, my guest is a returning guest, Dr. Ben Rein. Dr. Ben Rein is a neuroscientist, and he's also a soon-to-be best-selling author. He's got a new book coming out. It's called Why Brains Need Friends, the Neuroscience of Social Connection. So, Dr. Ben, welcome to the show, brother.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's good to be back. Been here once before.
Yeah, the podcast you did before was on, well, it was on a lot of things really, but we mostly focused on psychedelics, and I think, we did a pretty good job of covering that. But today, what I want to chat about is your new book that's coming out in a couple months. This podcast will drop right around then. And so, like I said, the title is Why Brains Need Friends, the Neuroscience of Social Connection. I think this is a very interesting topic, so I really want to ask you a few questions about that today. But just before we get into it, maybe you can give the audience just a little bit of a brief background about yourself for people who missed the first show.
Yeah, of course. So I'm a neuroscientist by training. I did my PhD research in neuroscience, studying autism spectrum disorder and the brain changes underlying autism, and then I did my postdoc at Stanford studying how MDMA, the drug ecstasy, enhances empathy in the brain. And, along the way, I discovered a passion for science communication and, getting science out to the public. I think we researchers tend to do our work in isolation. We publish in peer-reviewed scientific journals, which are all fantastic, but they're all paywalled. And once you get through those paywalls, if you choose to pay, and if you do, God bless you, then you get through and you can't read it because it's all full of jargon. That's a huge problem. And so I, along the way, I discovered that, like Dr. Mike, I appreciate, putting science out there to the public. And so I've taken a sort of detour where, instead of focusing on this, research, I'm now focusing on public messaging. And so part of that is writing a book about a lot of the research I've done and what we know about social interaction. And, the reason why I chose to write the book is because we've probably heard about this whole loneliness epidemic. We're getting more and more isolated. It seems to be some sort of problem. And we know kind of anecdotally, maybe I feel a little bit worse when I'm alone for an extended period of time. But I don't think that people really understand the biology of that, of what's really going on when we connect with others. Why is love, friendship, empathy so important for the brain? What does it really do for the brain? What does isolation do for the brain? And so I try to answer as many questions as the modern human would have about this topic, including a chapter on virtual interactions, a chapter on how drugs influence the social brain, a chapter on likability. So, the book is sort of a 2025 user's manual to being a human and navigating a social life that actually feeds and nourishes your brain. But aside from that, I also, I do some teaching. I'm a adjunct lecturer at Stanford where I teach how to communicate science. I'm trying to give back, teach the next generation of scientists to be public presenters and keep the public in the know about what the research is that they're doing. I'm also a clinical assistant professor at SUNY Buffalo, and I'm also the chief science officer of the Mind Science Foundation. And if you're a student in science, you should apply for a grant.
Awesome. Well, I follow you very closely on social media. And like we were talking about before the show, you do have this, incredible thing that you're doing right now where you're talking about, evaluating different supplements. So, I think that, you do a great job of educating the public. So I'm super pumped about your book.
Thank you.
So, one thing that people have discussed over and over is how, loneliness can affect the physical body, say as bad as some really deadly habits. And so my first question I have for you is loneliness really as deadly as smoking 15 cigarettes a day?
Approximately. Yeah. So that whole statistic, maybe people have heard that, if you're being isolated is worse for you or as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Obviously those two things affect the body differently, right? If you smoke cigarettes, it's going to preferentially harm your lungs, whereas isolation will preferentially harm your brain, but other systems as well. What that number comes from is basically that people who are isolated and lonely are just at a higher risk of death by any cause, which is kind of horrifying when you think about it. I mean, there are literally studies where they tracked hundreds of thousands of people for a decade. And they found that people who had weaker social relationships, who spent more time alone, didn't really have a sense of community, were 50% more likely to die by any cause. That means it's deadlier than smoking cigarettes, it's deadlier than being obese, it's deadlier than living in a polluted area. And that's not all. It's not just that these people drop dead randomly, it's because isolation increases the risk of dementia, heart failure, all sorts of complications with the general, the health of your tissues, including your heart, brain, et cetera. And it's also just bad for mood. It increases the risk of anxiety, depression, suicide. It is not good for you to be isolated. So, and we can get into why that is, which I'm sure you'll be curious.
Yeah. So like, I know that you said it's, increases all cause mortality, and, there's some certain things in there like suicide. Obviously, if you're talking about, mental health, suicide would be an obvious cause of mortality within that range. But like, what is the exact science behind it?
Of the increased mortality
overall?
Yeah. So generally what it seems to be is this. So isolation is a form of stress. We are social animals, social beings. We prefer to exist in groups. And when we're not in groups, a stress signal, an alarm system is basically triggered in our brains. And it's basically the brain saying, hey, get back to your community, get back to your tribe, probably based on an evolutionary history where being alone in an ancient world was probably very deadly. And you're more likely to survive in groups. So our brains start to get panicked. And what happens is cortisol levels rise. And if you're chronically isolated, if you're spending more time alone over a long period and your cortisol levels remain elevated, you're basically triggering a chronic stress response in yourself, which of course is super bad for you. We've probably heard as well that chronic stress is bad for you. But what this can do is that chronic stress can lead to chronic inflammation. And that's because cortisol is anti-inflammatory normally. And I know you're probably like, wait a minute. Cortisol is anti-inflammatory, but cortisol can make inflammation worse. The reason for that is if you have chronic stress, chronic isolation, chronically high cortisol levels, that anti-inflammatory property goes away. Your tissues stop responding to it. Or at least it diminishes how much they respond. So basically, one of your body's systems for pushing down inflammation is out of order. And so what can happen is that can lead over time to inflammation getting out of control because it's no longer being monitored and regulated by cortisol. That's really bad because when you have inflammation in like your brain, in your heart, in your tissue, whatever, any bodily tissues, it's generally interfering with the function of those tissues. And so not only might that predispose you to things like maybe a stroke or a heart attack or a heart failure, things like that, but also when that inflammation is in place and there is some adverse event, some negative, something bad happens, like you have a stroke, let's say, your tissue's ability to recover from that insult is not quite as strong. And so what we see in people who are isolated is also that they are much more likely to basically have severe complications from strokes and heart failure and things like that. So if you have a stroke and you're isolated, you leave the hospital and you go home and you go back to living by yourself, you're much more likely to die or to have another stroke after that. So it seems that it's kind of just weakening our overall resilience and health.
Okay. Yeah. That has come up. I don't know how many times I've heard that particular stat. So, I'm really happy that you were able to address that question here today.
Yeah. And the worst thing you could do is smoke 15 cigarettes a day and be isolated. Don't do that.
Yeah. I imagine that would complicate things even further.
Yeah.
Does having 2 or 3 good friendships affect the brain as positively as having 10 or 15?
Good question. Okay. So it depends on how you're asking about affect the brain. So there's kind of like 2 ways to think about what interaction does for the brain. One of them is, like I just described, being isolated is bad for you because of everything I just said. So on the other hand, being socializing is just good for you and by preventing those bad issues, basically. But the other thing that that interacting does for us is it actually is like a natural mood booster. It makes us feel better. It drives the release of neurotransmitters like oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, all things that are like reinforcing. They make us feel good. They make us want to go back for more. That's on purpose. That's so that we want to be around others. Like I said, we are social animals. The more time we spend around others, the more like safe we feel and protected. So to answer your question of is it better for the brain? There are studies actually showing that the more like different relationships you have, the more interactions you have with different people is better for you in terms of the second one, the mood benefits. That the more, for some reason, just interacting with the more different people is more maybe satisfying. Maybe it's because of what I just said, that it gives your brain that sense of, look at this nice big community I have surrounding me and protecting me. But in terms of the other one, in terms of like staving off isolation and its harmful effects, I think that, if you're getting the same amount of interaction overall between the two, I think there's probably no difference. If you have 2 or 1 or 3 really good friends, or 20 really good friends, I mean, you have the same amount of time to distribute, free time to distribute among those various people. And so, if you're spending 4 hours a week with your 2 good friends or 4 hours a week with your 20 good friends, you might have a better mood, maybe, based on those studies. But I think overall, it's going to be the same general effect on your overall health and well-being.
Okay, so my follow-up question to that would be, how much time do we need to spend with friends per week to have positive effects on the brain?
So everybody is different. This is really fascinating. So when I was really little, like in elementary school, this is actually one of the reasons why I study what I do and care so much about this. I've always been fascinated by like social differences that, like you can imagine. Go back in your mind to elementary school. You're sitting in the cafeteria. You're looking around at the tables around you. One table is a really, really, outgoing group of children. They're all like laughing and playing and talking. And then a few tables over, there's a table of kids sitting quietly and they're reading books or eating their lunches. And when I was young, I noticed that and I thought, man, this is so interesting that like what's different about these 2 groups of children that one of them is so much more outgoing. And that is basically present everywhere we look. You can look around a restaurant, a park, a party, whatever. You could see this scale, this sort of continuum of what I now recognize as extroversion. How extroverted is someone? How outgoing? There's all these qualities associated with extroversion. You're assertive. You don't mind like taking charge with people. You don't mind touching. Like reaching out, touching someone, or being expressive with your emotions. Those kids at that one table were more extroverted. And so the thing is, we all fall somewhere on this continuum of really, really introverted. We prefer to sit quietly, all the way up to super extroverted. You could be around people all the time and you never get tired of it. To recognize that is the key to the answer to your question. So if you, and there are actually trait extroversions, tests and assessments you can take. I actually include one in the book so that you can answer this question for yourself. But basically, the higher you score on that, the more extroverted you are, the more you stand to benefit from interacting on a sort of continual basis. Meaning, like, you could interact with someone every single day for a week and you don't get tired of it. Whereas, for the introverts listening, the thought of interacting with someone every single day is like, oh my gosh, like give me a day by myself, right? So I think what's important for everyone to do is sort of pinpoint approximately where are you on that continuum, and then try to build in as many interactions into your social life to get you to that point without pushing you over. And it's easy to tell when you're pushed over because it's like, shoot, I made plans with my buddy to get lunch today and I just do not feel like going. I'm like so tired. I'm over it. I'd rather just relax at home. And that's fine. Once you get to that point, you have satiated your brain's desire for social interaction. You've done what your brain needs, and everyone's going to be different. It might be, for me, I'm really extroverted. I could spend, 15, 20 hours a week with my friends, my family, and be content. And then I start to get like, that's enough. But other people, it might be, 15, 30 minutes is all you need. So it's really important to recognize sort of where you stand.
I imagine too, it would depend on like how your day is or like even what job you have. So like for me, myself, like I see sometimes like 60 patients in a day, which is,
my
crazy.
Gosh.
That's a lot of interactions, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes when I come home, I do just kind of want to like chill and do nothing for an hour. I like to work out usually, by myself is what I mostly do. But sometimes like I'll see that many people and like I'm still super excited to, go out and see my friends that night if we have something planned. So I think that maybe, you do have to, as you said, find where you are on that particular line of like extroversion and introversion. But I imagine though that could change a little bit from day to day depending upon your social interaction and largely too upon like your job. Like for you, for example, like if you're in a lab and you're kind of spending most of your time on your own, I imagine that after when you come home you're probably dying for some social interaction, right? But if someone is again like me and they're constantly having these different interactions with patients, they may feel more like, okay, I just need to kind of chill when I come home right now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the context of your recent life is super important, and because we're always kind of like, you can think of like your social life like a cup with fluid in it, right? And you start to like fill it up and it gets to the point where it's like overflowing. That's when you're at that point of that's too much for me, right? You might have a day of 60 patients and you're like, whoa, this is just way too much for my brain. I need the time alone. And the more time you spend alone, that cup starts to deplete and slowly drains of water until eventually you get to the point where it's at the bottom end of being, empty. And that's probably, metaphorically where those negative effects start to come in. And if you let it sit empty for too long, it's bad. So if you, let's say you've had, yesterday you had 5 patients, the day after you've had 60 patients, right? You might come home that day and be like, wow, I could really see my friends. And it's probably because the day before you only had 5, your cup only got filled up a little bit. And so, you might get to that point where it's full, it's overflowing, and then you don't, you somehow go into isolation for like a week. By the end of that week, your cup is going to be empty, most likely. I mean, I guess you could sort of imagine that everyone's cup drains at a different pace as well, right? We need more interaction to fill the cup. And then sometimes, I was just doing another podcast talking about this topic, and the podcaster, Dr. Spencer Lulk, he said, when I go to a party, I get sometimes like overwhelmed, like this cup gets full. And he's like, I'll go over and just like go in the bathroom for like 5 or 10 minutes and just kind of like decompress. And then I'll go back to the party. And I was like, well, when you do that, do you come back fully recharged, or are you like just like a little bit, more tolerant of interaction? And he's like, no, I feel completely refreshed. So like his cup is just like super quick to drain and he can come back out and feel ready to go. But I think it's also a good example of like how we can sort of monitor and regulate our social intake. I call it the social diet. What are we taking in? What are we putting into ourselves as far as the interactions we have? And I think we should be really thoughtful about, what those interactions are, because if you work in a job where you're constantly surrounded by people, but you absolutely despise your coworkers and you hate interacting with them all the time, but that's the only interaction you get, that's probably not good for you, right? You should be making sure that you're building in additional interactions that fill your cup in a meaningful way, right? You don't want your cup filled up with blood, taking this metaphor off the deep end, but you don't want to be filling your interactions with stuff that you don't enjoy. And so that's another tip that I suggest, is to really interrogate your social preferences and try to figure out like, what's the most fulfilling way to fill my cup? Is it, going one-on-one with a friend to lunch and, looking across the table at them into their eyes and having a good deep conversation? Or is that uncomfortable? Is it better to maybe go out with a group of your friends to a bar and, have a more kind of loose, relaxed interaction? What's your ideal sort of situation? And so another thing I include in the book is a social journal, where I propose that when you come home from an interaction, you should just take some notes about like, how did you feel? Where were you? How many people were there? What time was it? Try to get to the bottom of like, what can potentially make or break an interaction for you? Because I think if you can do that, then you can really figure out how to fill your cup, and not with blood, my wild metaphor.
And, with the journaling that you just discussed, so, I think it's great just to write down, your thoughts on paper, just because I think there is still, and maybe you would know, certainly better than I do, that like there is some kind of, brain connection with writing on paper versus say like typing. That being said, though, we do have ChatGPT now. ChatGPT 5 just came out recently. Like, do you think it's healthy for people to journal like to ChatGPT, or do you think it's better just to do the classic way and write on paper?
That's a good question. I have problems with ChatGPT and like AI chatbots, and I also think they're amazing. There's obviously, maybe you've heard, or the listener has heard, there's studies on using AI chatbots as like therapists. And they're kind of mixed, sometimes like it depends on the context. If people know it's an AI chatbot, it can make a difference. Generally people don't like to have therapy with a chatbot, but if they don't know, they think it's pretty good. And chatbots are pretty good at therapy in general. But, I don't know if we should cross the line to treating chatbots as friends, which is not the question you asked, but, I kind of naturally swirling in this mix where this sandbox we're playing in right now is should you kind of befriend AI chatbots? And I don't think so. I think that the brain has devoted systems to identify, am I interacting with a human or am I interacting with a water bottle, right? Like, and there's something special about human to human contact that, particularly tickles the brain and activates preferentially certain brain areas. There's evidence for that. We're still figuring out the whole, like, how does ChatGPT affect the brain? But anyways, all I mean to say is I don't think ChatGPT can replace a true human friendship. But for the purposes of what you're talking about, for getting through your feelings and working through emotions, especially if they're emotions that you don't necessarily feel comfortable talking about with another live human, I think it actually can be very valuable in that case where you're like, I really want to work through this, but like, I don't know if I could talk to my therapist about this. I don't know if I could talk to my friends about this. I mean, as long as you trust that these websites are not like using your information or data, the stuff you put in there, then yeah, go for it. I mean, and I'm not really the paranoid type with that. I mean, it's probably anonymous anyways.
Yeah, just figured it would, I didn't actually have that question planned, but, since we were talking about journaling, I listened to some podcasts recently where I think it was Chris Williamson and Dr. Mike Israel. I think that's how you say his name. And he was kind of saying, you can journal to, ChatGPT and kind of get some instant feedback. But my next question I have for you is, do old friendships or new friendships have a more positive impact on the brain? Meaning like, do you have more of a positive impact when you're hanging out with your friends from high school, or do you have a more of a positive impact when you're hanging out with friends that maybe just made recently?
That's a really good question. I actually don't know the answer to that, like from a scientific perspective. I mean, I think the closest thing that comes to mind is relationships. If you think about, romantic relationships, not friendships. The early stages of a romantic relationship are pretty magical. They, anyone who's fallen in love knows this. It's, it feels special. You don't want to be anywhere but with this person. Those periods of connection are characterized by really high levels of oxytocin. And actually, the higher the levels of oxytocin are in a couple, the more likely they are to end up staying together long term. And so that's, of course, a different context than friendships. But I think that when you meet someone and there is a sort of special connection, even on a friendship level, I do think there's something kind of spectacular about that, especially because it's pretty rare. On the other hand, though, I mean, if you look at long-term relationships like marriages, there are signs that basically those same kind of like intoxicating love, brain and body signals that we see in those early couples, they remain in couples that are happily married for even decades. And so, again, you kind of analogize this to friends. If you have a friend who you've been with for decades and you know them intimately, not intimately though in the romantic sense, you know them really well, I should say. I think maybe there's something special there too. I mean, there's no doubt about it that the two things you're describing, like clicking with someone really well right off the bat, or knowing someone for years and years and being a close friend, those two things are really spectacular and probably disproportionately beneficial, at least for your mood when you're interacting with someone, and I've moved around the country as an adult and tried to make friends, and, you meet people and you're like, gosh, like probably will never see this person again. I don't think I could imagine being like long-term friends. Nothing against them. It's not that I don't like them. It's just that I don't love them. Like they're just kind of okay for my brain. They don't really like fit the puzzle piece perfectly. There's no doubt that when you meet the person, you're like, this person's awesome. I could really imagine like being a long-term friend with this person. There's something special about that. And so, I mean, I would like to see some evidence on that. I'm surprised I don't know the science there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Newfoundland and, I live in Ontario now. So like, when I go back and see my friends in Newfoundland, it's always is like a little bit like special, and obviously there's other things that come into play there as well, because I'm going back home and not just, seeing my friends. But, it is sort of like a bit of a special feeling. You've mentioned oxytocin now, half a dozen times, I think, in this conversation. Maybe for the people who don't know what that is, could you explain what it is? And then my follow-up question to that is, I know you're not a prescriber, or I don't think you are, but I know that some people are actually prescribing oxytocin now. Are you for or against that? And do you think there are certain instances where, it can be prescribed and it can be helpful?
I haven't even heard about that. I want to answer that question first. What do you know what they're prescribing it for? Like, what's the context?
I think some of it is for PTSD. And then I think some of it is for, again, this is more like a very gray area, like a peptide-ish kind of like area.
Yeah.
I think some people are taking it before sex, essentially. And then some people, I think, just to maybe boost their mood in general, or for stress. But I think there are don't quote me on this, but I think there may be some studies on it, like smaller studies for PTSD. I don't know if those were, done in humans or done in rodents. And yes, like they have done studies with like PTSD in rodents before, even though it sounds super strange. And so I think those are more or less the context that it's used for.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, not knowing anything about that, I could imagine the applications, and let me answer your first question, and then I'll come back to that because it'll make more sense. So yeah, most people have heard of oxytocin as the love hormone, right? This is, I think, probably the way most people know about it is that when you have a child, you produce a ton of oxytocin. That's what sort of creates this unbreakable parent-child bond. But oxytocin does the same thing in a lot of contexts. It does it with romantic relationships as well. Like I said, in early stages of a relationship, people show higher levels of oxytocin than singles do. And that sustains in happily married couples. But the thing about oxytocin that's so cool is people know it as this like love hormone, but like what's it actually doing in the brain? Well, you mentioned that people are taking oxytocin for improving their mood, which makes sense because oxytocin, the way it acts in the brain, it seems to drive two neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine. I mentioned that earlier. But the way it kind of seems to go is like being around someone you care about or having a pleasant social interaction drives oxytocin release. And you can think of oxytocin like this big domino that falls and knocks over these two other dominoes that are, one is serotonin and one is dopamine. Dopamine, of course, is just inherently reinforcing. It's the brain's way of saying, this thing we're experiencing is good and valuable and maybe healthy, and we should come back to it. And, not always healthy. Cocaine stimulates dopamine release. Your brain's not saying this is healthy. Your brain is saying this feels good and I want to do more of this. Interesting, in itself that socializing also stimulates the same brain signals that cocaine or, taking a pleasant shower, hot shower, or eating a delicious meal, these things that your brain recognizes as worth going back for. And again, that's because we are social animals. The serotonin component, there's all this like, is serotonin associated with mood? Not really sure. Maybe so, generally could be. But the place where serotonin is being driven from social interaction seems to be a brain area called the nucleus accumbens, which is involved in motivation and reward and decision making based on like the value of our options. So, and there's a bunch of research showing that like this serotonin release in the nucleus accumbens is really, really important for just making socializing what we would call appetitive or like interesting, you want to do it. So it seems that oxytocin is like driving this social bonding by driving what's called social reward. It's making interaction rewarding and pleasant, making us feel good so that we say, yeah, you know what, I probably want to do this again. And that's probably the reason why when you fall in love with someone in the early stages of a relationship, you're like, I just want to be near with this person all the time because they are so reinforcing to your brain that you just feel rewarded by their presence. That being around them feels productive. It feels like you're accomplishing something. And so that's like unbeatable. But the other thing about oxytocin that's really cool that, I actually learned some of these things while I was writing the book. I didn't know this. So oxytocin, some researchers call it nature's medicine because it doesn't just make us grow closer together. It also is supportive for our health. And this is another reason why interaction is valuable. So oxytocin is anti-inflammatory. It is neuroprotective. It can support the function of the immune system. It can reduce anxiety and, social anxiety and stress. It maybe even supports bone health. Apparently bone cells have oxytocin receptors. So there are all these amazing things in the body that oxytocin does, which is probably because when we are falling in love and we have the opportunity to mate, which is, the optimal circumstance if you're on planet Earth, the best thing you could possibly do is procreate. You want to make more of you. In that circumstance where you can do that, you want your body to be as healthy as possible so that you can successfully reproduce. And then once the baby comes, you want to be healthy so that you can basically be there to protect it and not die of a heart attack or stroke. So being around others is super good for us because of oxytocin, not just because it makes us feel good, it makes our mood better, but it also seems to like support our overall health. So coming back to the idea of prescribing oxytocin, I could see, why. Like I said, I could imagine why you might want to do this. My only concern would be like, well, one of several concerns would be like, what does this do to your natural oxytocin production? Like, does it interfere with that? Are you sort of artificially stealing something that's reserved for like a really important thing for the brain? Like, socializing is such an important signal. It's kind of like, you can sort of analogize it to like the idea of taking melatonin, right? To like adjust your sleep cycles, when like your brain and body are meant to be producing melatonin naturally at a certain time to make sure that you sleep. You basically regulate your circadian rhythm. So if you supplement with melatonin, how is that interfering with your body's natural production of it? So I'd be curious about that. Like, if you take oxytocin when you're by yourself, what does that do? I'd be really interested to see those studies.
Yeah. And I think too, what you said, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I do think that if you abuse it or don't take it properly, it does lead to some downregulation of your receptors in the long term, like you kind of had concerns about. Just like anything, like if you take testosterone, then, your body's own testosterone shuts down. And so there definitely are some concerns about it. And I've never, prescribed it before, but, I do think that there are some people out there who are prescribing it. Again, I don't know how much, success they've had, but again, just because, we were talking about oxytocin, I just thought I'd, ask you about that.
Yeah, I will add one thing on that. This is not a formal endorsement of this idea, but I would imagine taking oxytocin before sex would dramatically improve the sex, because having higher levels of oxytocin seems to make social touch feel more pleasant. Like, there's studies where they you can squirt oxytocin up your nose and it makes it, increases your oxytocin levels. And when they do that to these people in studies, and then they have them, like get a massage on their legs or something like that, they report it as feeling better when they have oxytocin. And also, oxytocin is implicated or involved in sex itself. So, again, when you have sex with someone and you are potentially reproducing, you're making a child, oxytocin is released at super high levels, because it's your body's way of telling you, okay, this person you should really care about, because there's a chance that a baby's on the way and you two should be together to take care of the baby. And so taking oxytocin before sex might result in better feeling sex and also potentially a stronger connection with the person after. But that's just, based on sort of some data out there, not like actual experience, certainly from me.
I wonder too, if for girls who have, who struggle with not being able to orgasm, if they took it before, like just based upon what do you think that may help females who struggle with that?
I'm not sure. I know that oxytocin is basically peaks during orgasm. Whether having higher levels of oxytocin before increases the odds of orgasm, I'm not sure, but it could be possible.
Okay. All right. Well, now everyone knows a little bit more about oxytocin, and considering you kind of gave it a slight, I don't want to say endorsement, I'm sure.
I said no endorsement.
It's just being, sold off the shelves right now. My next question comes, I think about sports really when I think about this, and maybe guys in the military, or even, someone like yourself who, has just written a book. I'm sure you've had some help from some other people who have, helped you with this book. Does overcoming a common obstacle or achieving a goal with a friend create a stronger bond?
Totally. I mean, one of the strongest signals that the brain looks for when it comes to like building affiliation and like identifying someone as a friend is what you have in common. And on the other side of that, one of the biggest dividers is what you don't have in common. So if you've worked together, if you've been like in the military together, serving together, working together for years, you have such an incredibly strong bond. Your brain will see them as someone that's in your in-group. And there's research showing that, when people are viewed as in your in-group, your brain treats them very differently and much better. Specifically, the brain's empathy systems like get way more fired up and turn on for someone who's in your in-group, meaning that we actually like understand the emotions better of people in our in-group, and we like share their emotions. We care more about them, and naturally we take on their emotions more strongly. So the other thing here too is there's this concept of interbrain synchrony, which is where when two people are interacting, their brain waves can basically, I don't want to say synchronize or sync up. It's more that if both those people were wearing brain sensors, they would see the same patterns of activity in both brains at the same time. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily synchronizing or like doing some like crazy quantum physics thing, but that they are like on the same wavelength. And it seems that when people work together, when they collaborate on a task, that preferentially drives interbrain synchrony. So there's something special about teamwork that literally just like helps brains get on the same page.
Yeah, because like even recently, I was on this hockey team in high school. In our very first year, we just had a really insane team, really, really good group. And even over the last couple of years, like every now and then someone will just post, a picture of that particular team. And like every time I see it, I almost just get like chills or, I feel good or whatever it is that like you want to describe about that feeling, and it's just because of, there's so many memories with all those people on that particular team. And I feel that there's a lot of people out there who have, overcome certain obstacles. Again, it doesn't have to be a team, but, for whatever reason, sports is something that, many people can relate to, as many people, are probably played on one sports team at some point in their life. And they have sort of like the same feeling and sort of the same bonds overall. So I can imagine that, what you're describing there, makes sense for a lot of people who are listening to this.
Yeah. And what else is really powerful about what you're describing is that not only do you share this thing of being on the same team, but you defeated a common enemy together.
Yeah.
Whatever the opposing team was, you won the championship. That is so powerful. That is so tribalistic, right? Like I think about this all the time in terms of sport. Like we're tribal, right? We come from tribes where we would exist in groups and we would compete with each other for resources. And now like, I'm a big football fan, American football. And so I think about like, I'm a Buffalo Bills fan, and like why is it that people will spend hundreds of dollars to go and stand in a stadium and scream and boo at the other team
freezing cold too,
in freezing cold, and go through these like, I don't know, maybe unpleasant, sometimes unpleasant, but like just pretty extreme, bizarre human behaviors. And it's because sport captures that tribalism so effectively and makes you think, those goddamn New York Jets, I hate them. And then the next week, a guy from the Jets gets traded to the Bills and it's like, oh, I love this guy. He's one of us now. It's so silly and it's so effective, because sport, it's so good at dividing, like literally these people are on our team, these people are our enemy. And that just like captivates the human brain.
Yeah. It's like, even when you score a goal in hockey, like those little huddles after are so weird. Like everyone's just, there's 5 dudes, everyone's just like, fuck yeah. And then you go by the bench and, you hit everyone on the glove. Like it's definitely a very tribal thing, as you said.
Yeah, it is, but it's great. I mean, it's good for us.
Yeah, it's definitely good for us. How does our relationship with our wife or our husband affect our brain in terms of loneliness?
Those relationships, a romantic relationship, are arguably the most valuable relationship you can possibly have. Just based on like the sort of general effects they have on our health and well-being and our mental health. Romantic relationships and parent-child relationships are like special for the brain. They drive more oxytocin release, and so therefore they may have more of those just like general health promoting effects. There's an amazing statistic. I have a whole chapter in the book about like deep connection and love and sex and, just what sets these relationships apart. And I open the chapter with this unbelievable statistic that people who are diagnosed with colorectal cancer, if they are married, they are 28% more likely to survive. And that's actually a stronger predictor than whether or not if they go through chemotherapy. It's just whether they're married. Unbelievable. And the same is true for many other forms of cancer, and I list all the numbers in the book. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but it's like, prostate cancer, like 22% more likely to survive if you're married, all the various cancers, head and neck cancer.
But that's crazy, because just to put it in perspective, that's almost like as powerful as some like, medical interventions.
It's unbelievable. And, part of it too is like the chemotherapy is kind of like wrapped up in there, because what also happens is that people who are married are more likely to do chemotherapy because their partner is telling them, hey, look, please, I need you to take on whatever is going to support your likelihood of survival. And there is, evidence that single people generally take less medical care in cancer. So it's probably that social support and encouragement and like having a purpose to sort of fight for, right? but also the social support itself, like the value of just love for the brain is so incredibly outstanding because of all of these amazing things it's doing, and just having social support, and just the difference between coming home every day from work to an empty household versus the person you love the most. I mean, that, like, just think about the difference, how that stacks up over the course of an entire lifetime. It's so valuable. And but also, with that said, I worry about when I talk about this that people are going to be like, oh my gosh, well, I hate my partner, but I'm going to stay with them because apparently it's good for me. Like, no, not true. If you are in a relationship that's not good for you, I mean, think about that too. You come home every day from work to a household where your biggest enemy is there. That's not good either. So long-term relationships can be like the pinnacle of human well-being, but they can also, get in our way if they're not healthy. So, it's important to basically vet your partner carefully and make sure that, they're giving the best thing they can for your brain.
Yeah, I mean, I actually just experienced this because unfortunately we had to delay this podcast a couple of weeks because I had surgery. But my fiance is a nurse, and she was just awesome during the whole time I was home. Had popsicles ready for me, ice cream, like, she was there with me, like, right before I went into surgery, obviously picked me up after surgery.
I'm going to add to this that Dr. Mike's surgery was related to his throat, and not that he always gets popsicles and ice cream after any surgery. I think that's an important detail.
Yeah, I had sleep apnea, and I had a uvuoplasty. I know that's a big word. A UPPP is what they call it. I had my septum fixed as well, and then also sinus surgery. So it was quite a bit. It was really the UPP part to my throat that, absolutely killed. But, just having someone there at home and having all those, again, yes, don't eat ice cream and popsicles all the time.
It was an ankle surgery, but just needed, popsicles and ice cream.
But those first 3 or 4 days, that was really all I could get down. And, to have someone around, just made a huge, huge difference. So, what you just said, just, resonated with me, just right there. One question I have for you is, this is kind of almost 3 questions in one, is like, how consistent does friendship have to be across a lifetime? And is it okay to have small breaks where you are truly lonely? And how long would it be too long before it really affects your brain?
So generally, social interaction is not consistent across a lifetime, just based on the numbers. Like if you look at, there's a graph, there's data on how much time people spend like alone, with others, with friends, with family. And if you look at it across a lifespan, the amount of time spent by yourself steadily climbs higher and higher until eventually you get to like your 70s and you're spending like massive amounts of time alone every single day. We naturally become lonelier as we age, which is, by the way, a problem because loneliness is bad for health. And what else is really bad for health is being old. And so when you have those two things combining and synergizing, it's no wonder that a lot of older people suffer from a lot of ailments, because I think that I actually truly believe that isolation in the elderly is one of like the biggest unspoken health crises of our time, and that we need to be spending more time and building more social programs for those people. So it matters across the lifespan. And I think if you can build like social habits and establish social interaction as a component of your life, you get an intentional component earlier, then I think you'll be more likely to sustain those habits as you grow into those periods of isolation in later life. Remind me your second or third parts of the question.
Yeah. So is it okay to have small breaks where you're truly lonely, and how long is too long? Because like some people may have like a work assignment where they're, going to be by themselves essentially for like 3 months, or some people, may be moving to, a new university where, maybe they'll make friends right away, but maybe not. And so like how long can people go before, it truly affects their brain?
Yeah. I mean, really great questions. I think if, you should try to avoid these periods of loneliness and isolation, of course. But I'm not going to say like, oh, you got an opportunity to study abroad in Paris for 3 months. Like, don't go because it's going to be bad for your brain. Like, no, I mean, you got to balance it, I think. But maybe a more balanced piece of advice is in those periods where you're predisposed to loneliness, try to take it or make up for it however you can, like build in FaceTimes, phone calls, whatever you can do. Maybe go be out in public. You could go, instead of sitting in your apartment working on your computer, you could go to a coffee shop and just be around people, talk to the barista. I mean, build in as much as you can. Generally, like for the last question, like how long is too long? I mean, the longer, the worse, basically. And, we can look at like COVID, for example. There's studies that show that people who were held, in isolation or quarantined or, basically when the lockdown started, if they were by themselves, the longer they were by themselves, the more depressed they were and, the harder they took it. So, you want to avoid chronic long-term isolation, but I mean, sure, in a dream world, you would never have to go through periods like that, but life is life. And, so everything's a trade-off, right? Like you have a great job opportunity. You're going to go to a new university or a new job or whatever. It's going to be big for your career, but you're going to be a little lonely. Like, I'm not going to be the scientist who's like, don't take that opportunity, like just do what you got to do. And my goal with this book and with this messaging I'm doing is basically to just get people to like consider that, like think about that when they're making this decision of, oh, do I go to this study abroad thing? At least think like, well, I'm going to be pretty lonely. So like maybe when I get there, I'll make an effort in the first week or two to try and make some friends. Just something like that, like just have it in your mind, because I don't think right now people really think much about it and they definitely don't prioritize it. I think in my mind, I cluster socializing in the same grouping as like sleep, exercise, diet. Like it is one of those pieces of nutrition and like nourishment for the brain and body. But I think most people tend to cluster socializing in the same category as like going to get ice cream or like going to see a movie, like leisurely activities, right? Things that we do for fun, going to the mall, right? Like, but it's not. It doesn't belong there. We're fortunate that it's so pleasant that it does fall into those categories, but it really shouldn't be viewed as like an optional sort of, oh, I have some time on Friday night, I'll do it. It should be more of like a, did I get enough of this week? And like we think about sleep or exercise.
Yeah, I like your idea too of sort of like planning it. So if you are going somewhere, maybe see if there's like, if you're into running, like maybe, sign up for the running group, or even just small things like you said, like, going to a coffee shop, or if you're going to go to the restaurant, maybe like sit at the bar, and you might have, more of a conversation with, the person who's, at the bar versus say just a waiter who's just kind of coming to check on you every now and then. So I think there are some things you can do to sort of like protect yourself, ahead of time while still being able to, capitalize on those opportunities.
Yeah. And on that note too, talk to strangers, and not just on study abroad or vacation, all the time. Like there's studies that show that basically people feel awkward about talking to strangers. They expect to be rejected. They don't think it's going to be worthwhile. But in truth, the exact opposite is true. People are hardly ever rejected. They enjoy the interactions. They learn things. This is one of those things that I personally do in my life. Like when I'm, sitting in the waiting room at a doctor's office and there's someone next to me and, we're both just like sitting in silence and like in that horrible period of just waiting for the doctor to show up, start a conversation, or like on the train, on the bus, on the airplane. I'm a big airplane talker. So if you sit next to me on a plane, I'm sorry in advance. I will let you go if you put your headphones in. I get it. I'll understand the signal. But I mean, gosh, I love talking to people, and just don't be afraid to do that, because it's literally good for you. And it also, the other benefit, aside from just like making us, supplementing our interactions, it also provides this like really sort of special sense of community. Like when you start talking to a random person and they relate to you and you actually enjoy it, it gives you this sense of like comfort of like, wow, this, like I have like hidden allies all around me, like these people are great and I didn't even know. Like
we're all connected. I know that sounds so like hippie and woo woo, but it's true. Like you do get that feeling,
Right. Yeah.
My next question I have for you, this kind of, relates back to a little bit of what you were just saying. Is social media and technology making people more lonely? And so how I think it relates to the last question is that only about 2 years ago or so, I got an iPad, and, generally speaking now, when I get on an airplane, I watch TV shows instead of, maybe talking to the person next to me, which obviously decreases social interaction. But in general, do you find that social media and technology is making people more lonely?
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure. people who use social media more are more lonely. But is it because they are lonelier, so they use social media? They're kind of hanging around, sitting around, so they use social media, or is it that being on social media so much makes them lonely? It's hard to know. But generally, I don't think social media is incredibly good for us. There are studies that, similarly, people who use social media more, they are more anxious, they're more depressed, they don't sleep as well. They have fewer friendships in real life. Again, sort of a chicken or the egg thing, right? But I don't think that social media is very good. And, especially because I'll go, like, let's say go to a university and give a talk, and afterwards some people are coming up and asking me questions, and they're like, oh, it comes up that I post videos on the internet, or, on TikTok specifically. I'm like, oh yeah, I post short educational clips on there. And I've heard so many times people saying, I don't have TikTok, I had to delete it because I was literally just losing my life. Like the algorithms were so good at knowing what I wanted to see that I would just lose like 3-4 hours just swiping away. And before I know it, I check and I'm like, oh my gosh, I just wasted, like, it's 2 a.m. and I haven't slept. And that, I think, is really bad. Aside from just like the virtual interaction component, just sort of the way that these platforms are really intentionally built to captivate us and our attention and feed us advertisements along the way. Of course, that's the whole purpose. But like, I don't think that's really good for the consumer. And also, we have to recognize that, there is this unprecedented opportunity on social media to, reach a very wide audience, gain a massive amount of followers, get brand deals. There's going viral is a huge incentive for the average person. So the information ecosystem is just flooded with people competing for attention. And so, like, it's weird because it's taking humanity and sort of like turning us on ourselves. Like, we're trying to like flood these websites with information, or not even just information, but like entertainment materials that will captivate each other and like suck away their attention. And it's just amazing how this system that has incentives for both the creators and the viewers is like turning us on ourselves. It's really kind of like scary in a way.
Yeah, I think, one thing that we can all do maybe a better job of is, create your algorithm, towards things that actually make your life better. And, we say that, like, we get caught in, scrolling, and certainly, I'm victim to that as well. But, for the most part, what I follow is like, science and science people and, things that I actually learn from. And like, the thing with like the algorithm is like, the algorithm is part of the issue, but really the issue is what you're clicking on. Because if you just keep clicking on, things that make you angry or things that make you upset, then that's what your algorithm is going to be fed with. But if you actually just click on, science, and you click on things that are positive and things that make you happy, things that make you feel good, that is what your algorithm will, fill up with. So I think that, we need to teach people how to use social media. I think that it's a tool, it's here to stay. And I think that unfortunately, there's never been like a guide, certainly for, children or adults, I'm not really aware of anyone anyway that's really, put out like a guide on how to use social media. And so, while we can blame the algorithm, I think we have to blame ourselves more. Like, don't click on things that are going to make you angry and upset. Click on things that, are going to provide you with education and things that you can like implement into your own life to, make your life better. And like, I'm going to plug you, like, your social media is awesome. Every time that, I watch one of your videos, I learn something, which is, amazing. I don't feel like I'm angry or anything after, like there's some kind of like conflict going on, like we see someone blown up or something like that. And like, people will say, yeah, but then, I'm not going to feel like I'm informed. You'll get informed by the big things somehow, some way, like you can curate your social media to yourself. And then, if something in the world does happen that is, a massive event, like you'll find out somehow, some way. So, that's my sort of, take on that overall.
Yeah, I have so much to say on that too. I mean, first off, I think I keep seeing more and more also on social media of like genuinely terrible content, like videos of a school shooter or videos of like a semi truck like crushing a car, or videos of a bar fight, where someone gets knocked out, like things that most people are not meant to see or will not naturally see, but they are captivating to the brain because they're when you see, it's like, why can you not look away from a car crash? Well, it's because your brain wants to pay attention so that it might learn something that could potentially save your life down the road if you're in a bad situation too, right? It's like, why do we have nightmares? Well, maybe it's because it's simulating horrifying experiences so that we can be better prepared when they occur to us in real life. So that's so captivating, these horrifying things. And so it's very easy to fall into a place where your entire social media feed is dominated by these horrifying videos. So in addition to not just clicking on it, don't even view it. Like the algorithm uses that as well, how like your view time. And I've noticed that happening to myself recently where, I open up Instagram and there's a video of a car accident and I'm just like staring at it. I'm captivated. In my head, I'm thinking, swipe away. You don't want more of this in your feed. But I'm like, I can't look away. Like I literally can't look away from a car accident. Classic situation. But like the faster you swipe away, or you can even go and like there's usually in the bottom right, there's like 3 dots or somewhere there'll be a couple dots and you can press it and say like, not interested in this content or something like that. You can actually like filter stuff out. The other thing I want to say on that is in addition to like that type of content, obviously in America right now and globally really, we have more and more like divisive, inflammatory political content. And I think that can be really attention grabbing, right? It's always like you want to know what's going on in this like tribalistic, again, battle between 2 factions, right? Like I support this faction, they're competing against that faction. It's taking advantage of our brains. But I think when you're constantly focusing on, some news about your opponent, right? Or news about how this battle is advancing, that's also bad for your brain because it's telling you, oh, look, a news story comes out about like, let's say you're anti-Trump and a news story comes out that Trump just passed a new bill that you don't agree with. Like that is creating this sense in your brain of like your opposing tribe is winning and your community is losing. And that is just so distressing for you. And if you're paying super close attention to every single thing happening in the news politically, like you are going to be shell shocked. And if that's you, if that sounds like you, and people in my life who are like this, look away. I know it may feel awful to do so, but paying super close attention is horrible for you. I promise. It's definitely making you more stressed than you need to be.
Yeah. And I think also too, like it's okay to be a little bit ignorant to some things. Like we can't know everything. So, like I said, like the big stuff, that will come up, that will get to you eventually. So if you don't know it, like don't be embarrassed if someone asks you about some political thing at a party and you don't know, like who cares, just kind of like move on from that.
Yeah.
The next question I have for you is, can a relationship with your pet have protective effects against loneliness?
Absolutely. Yeah. So no disrespect to other animals besides dogs, but dogs are really well studied for this because, we have this long history, like humans and dogs have coexisted for like 30 to 40,000 years. And in fact, there's studies showing that if we look at the genomes of dogs and humans, over time, they have gotten more and more similar, which doesn't suggest that we are becoming dogs or that dogs are becoming humans. It suggests that we have gone through the same battles and our genes had to change. Like, and by the same battles, I mean, like, let's say, a climate change in an area that we existed, or, some food scarcity that caused us to shift to a new diet. And so our genes had to adapt through natural selection so that we were able to survive in that environment. Humans and dogs showed the same changes over time, suggesting that we like literally took on the challenges and battles of ancient Earth together and came out as one. And so because of that, because we've been such good buddies for so long, dogs have sort of like hijacked our parent-child bonding relationships, that oxytocin, to basically cozy up to us because it helps them survive. It helps us survive. Biology needed the glue to keep us together, and it's oxytocin, the same stuff that keeps parents and children together, romantic partners together. And yeah, I mean, dogs are just like, they're like putting an ice pack on the nervous system. Like being around a dog, research shows that it can increase like dopamine levels, oxytocin levels, lower cortisol, lower heart rate. People who have dogs are more likely to survive, basically. It increases or decreases mortality and also decreases the risk of things like heart disease and whatnot. And so, going back to what I said about this, public health crisis about like loneliness in seniors, I actually think that basically giving older people who are lonely a dog could be a potential great way to support their health and well-being. And I think the same goes for really any point in the lifespan. If you have a dog, there's a genuine sense of companionship there, and it's good for your brain.
That's awesome. That's awesome to hear. And I'm a big dog lover. I imagine too, though, that it does depend a little bit upon like the kind of dog that you have. Like if you have something like, a French bulldog or, that's what I had. Unfortunately, she's not with me anymore. But if you have a French bulldog, or if you have like, a golden retriever, like dogs that are sort of like known to just be, for lack of a better word, like nothing but loving, very, very excellent companions, like that would make a difference, say, over a dog who's sort of like more to be like, a trained kind of killer, so to speak, maybe
like a hunting.
Yeah, like a hunting dog.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, I think that you can still build. I mean, my dog is the latter. My dog is a border collie pointer lab mix. So she's super energetic. She's an absolute nut. Like she's always doing something crazy. And she's not super affectionate. Like there's like early in the morning and then late in the evening, she'll like crawl into bed and cuddle on me. And it's the cutest thing ever. And I just cherish those moments. But if I go up to her during the day and I like pet her, she'll like basically like step back and stare at me and be like, what are we doing? Are we going to go play with the ball? Like, are we going to go for a walk? Like what's happening now? She like doesn't, like that's her joy in life. But like, I still like cherish her, it's like, it's kind of like asking the question of like, if you have a daughter or son, a child who, maybe they're a little different from you. Like maybe you you played sports in high school, but they're like in the band, like they're not as affiliative to you. Like, do you still get as much joy out of it? I would think yes. I think maybe it's good to have that like extra companionship, but like there's no doubt for me anecdotally, I still love my dog to death, would do anything for her, even though she refuses my, offers for pets sometimes.
Well, thanks for answering that question, because I know there's a lot of people with dogs out there that's, certainly love their dogs. I'm sure they're very happy to hear that, it can, protect against loneliness.
I mean, unless you hate your dog, if you hate your dog, then it's probably not good for you. Well, but I don't think anyone hates their dog. I mean,
yeah, hopefully there's not too many people out there like that. I know we only have a few minutes left, and considering your background, I do want to ask you this question: like, why do drugs like MDMA specifically like supercharge feelings of connection and can harness an effect that just we can't do sometimes naturally?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate that I can answer this from some of my own research. I mentioned earlier, I think at the beginning, that I studied this at Stanford. So MDMA in the body, what it does is it primarily stimulates three neurotransmitters: norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. What you might notice about those latter two is that they are directly overlapping with the brain systems that drive social reward. And I think that is pretty much precisely what's going on. So that, the fact that oxytocin and ecstasy stimulate the same two brain systems says a lot about how important socializing is, and that how pleasant socializing can be, and also maybe what exactly MDMA is doing. I think that what MDMA is doing is basically, what it goes physiologically, what it does is it basically completely screws up the systems that control the release of dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine. And when neurons are sending them to each other, it like totally screws that up and causes those neurotransmitters to just be like dumped in excessive amounts. And so I think what's happening when we feel this excessive empathy and excessive love and companionship and camaraderie is that it's basically taking the brain systems that tell you this person is special, this person is worth being around, this person is pleasant, rewarding, you care about this person, you love this person, and just driving them to what we would call supra-physiological levels, meaning levels that would never happen naturally in the brain. You're taking the shovel and just tossing all the dopamine and serotonin into the synapse, and that's just like making you feel not only amazing, but also super connected to the people around you. And so we kind of validated this, that what I just said in mice, finding that I mentioned earlier, serotonin in a brain area called the nucleus accumbens is really important. That specific brain signal seems to be exactly what MDMA is touching on, specifically to drive empathy. That it's been long known that MDMA can make people more empathic. It's called an empathogen. why? What's it doing in the brain? Well, it seems that it all, despite all these different systems that it's acting on, all these different brain areas that MDMA is acting on, if you just have it act on serotonin and the nucleus accumbens and that's it, it still increases empathy. And so, I think that all of these social changes that people experience on this drug probably come down to the fact that it's manipulating these social reward and social interaction systems in the brain that are typically reserved for telling us, hey, this interaction feels pretty good and I should probably see this person again.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of people who have had, really positive, experiences on MDMA, with their partner, in particular. Like sometimes, when people do it safely, obviously, like under some kind of supervision, people report anyway that they just have these wonderful conversations, breakthroughs, and things that they necessarily wouldn't, talk about. And, it leads to, long-term happiness in the relationship if you are able to integrate that and if you go into it with good intention. So what you just said makes total sense.
And that's actually, back in the, I think it was the 60s, when MDMA was first sort of like discovered by the public. That's how it was used up in Northern California. A lot of psychotherapists were giving it to couples and doing couples therapy, and they were finding that it was like unbelievable. It was super effective. But of course, then, it was classified as a Schedule 1 illegal drug, and, that research stopped. And only recently in the last decade has it come back. But not for use in couples therapy, but in PTSD. And the reasoning for that, by the way, it seems that, PTSD, of course, you have really painful, traumatic memories that are, debilitating. And with MDMA on board, everything takes on this incredibly pleasant, euphoric hue. So if you can be working with a therapist and with MDMA, you can suddenly address this really painful, traumatic memory in a way that you never have before, because normally it's too painful to even approach the memory in your mind. But now with MDMA, everything's so euphoric that it doesn't feel so awful. It's tolerable to explore. And so you can make really dramatic progress with psychotherapy in those periods of ecstasy. And that seems to be maybe what's going on, because MDMA, to be helpful for PTSD, it needs to be paired with psychotherapy. It seems like if you have PTSD and you go to Coachella and you take ecstasy, it's probably not going to heal your PTSD, but if you do so in the right context, it could be very, very valuable.
Yeah, because again, it brings up those conversations or those blocks that you have that you're basically unwilling to have. But, because of the physiological effects of the MDMA, you're able to have some conversations that you're unwilling to have, without the MDMA. And then that leads to, long-term progress. So yeah, right. It definitely needs to be combined with therapy. So I know we went over our hour here, Ben. I know that you're a super busy guy. So please tell us, more about the book, and if you want to, a little bit about your supplement, not regimen, but your supplement reviews that you're doing online, which again, I just think that's, something that's very valuable and very needed.
Yeah. Well, so I've been on social media for 5 years now, a little bit longer even, doing just short form educational videos. And I recently started a series called Do Supplements Really Work? And each video, I analyze all of the peer-reviewed science out there on a particular supplement, and not all of it because there's a huge amount. But, so for the first one, I looked at lion's mane. People say lion's mane can help you grow new brain cells and improve cognition. Is that true? Well, there's real science on that. If you want to know the answer, you have to go watch the video. And then ashwagandha, creatine,
saffron you did, St. John wort.
Yep. Thank you. Omega-3s, magnesium. So I've been working my way through this list, and people have found it to be super, super helpful. And it's also honestly helpful for me because I've always been curious. And so I've done 8 so far, and I would say 5 of the 8 are actually surprisingly pretty good. That, I've been surprised because, I think supplements have a really sort of a negative connotation in academic circles where people are like, oh, supplements are, bogus. They're not FDA tested. But, there is research on these things, and 5 out of the 8 that I've done, I was pretty impressed. And the other 3, I was not very impressed. So anyways, if you're curious about that series, I'm on social media, Dr. Ben Rein, Rein. And, The book, as I mentioned, comes out October 14th. It's called Why Brains Need Friends. It's not about supplements. It's about friendships. And that's available. It's, depending on what date this podcast comes out, it's available for pre-order now up until October 14th. Thereafter, it'll be available for just purchase at anywhere. You could pre-order it to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, whatever. And basically pre-ordering just basically says, here's my credit card information, charge me on October 14th, and it shows up at your doorstep that day. Yeah.
Awesome. Anything I'm sure there are lots, but anything that we didn't cover in the podcast that you think is super valuable in the book?
I don't think so. I mean, I think this has been a really great conversation. We've covered a lot, and there's obviously so much more in the book that I didn't cover here, and several hundred pages of material versus an hour conversation. But I think that we've gotten through a lot of the key principles, which is important because, at the end of the day, if you buy the book, thank you. If not, it's okay. I just, I want people to understand that it's really important to connect with others, and that it's not just a nice to have. It's really something that we really need. So hopefully this conversation made an impact on you as the listener.
Awesome. Well, Ben, thank you so much again for coming on. I so appreciate it. Congratulations on the book. I know it's going to be a big hit. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And as always, I'll be back with another episode soon.